Leaders are confident long-standing Chinese restrictions on imports of U.S. beef will be lifted. China is concerned about the safety of U.S. beef since the mad cow disease broke out in 2003.
Some experts are saying the increases could come as a result of the new reciprocal tariffs put in place yesterday by President Trump. So what does all of this mean for our local beef, cattle, and pork farmers? Mark Livermore.
China has just shaken the global agricultural market by abruptly halting imports of more than 150,000 tons of U.S. beef worth roughly USD 500 million without any prior notice. The move came only days after Washington announced new tariffs targeting electric vehicles from China. According to trade experts, this is not simply a matter of food safety or quarantine standards. Instead, it reflects the intensifying strategic tensions between the world's two largest economies. U.S. exporters who had been counting on the Chinese market are now reeling from sudden revenue losses, while competitors have been quick to step in and fill the gap. Before we go further, don't forget to hit the like button to support the channel. It helps us beat the YouTube algorithm. In practice, the suspension of U.S. beef imports followed quiet inspections at Chinese ports, which coincided with Washington's expansion of tariff measures. Beijing cited food safety concerns, but analysts argue this was a carefully calculated move meant to send a direct message to Washington. In 2024, U.S. beef exports to China exceeded $1.2 billion, a growingly vital outlet for American agriculture. China's sudden cutoff without any negotiation shows that bilateral trade relations have entered a new phase of uncertainty. This is no longer just about a few shipments being blocked. It is a clear sign that global trade can be swayed in an instant by political decisions. Data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, shows that in just a matter of weeks, more than 520 million U.S. worth of beef orders were either canceled or redirected. Major cattle-producing states such as Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska have been hit hardest. Ranchers are now struggling with surplus herds and no market access, driving down domestic prices and tightening financial pressures. A rancher in Nebraska told reporters that contracts planned months in advance are now being dumped on the domestic market at significant losses. The fallout extends well beyond farms. Feed suppliers, transport companies, and cold storage providers have all reported disruptions, with some even resorting to layoffs. While China pointed to food safety concerns, many policy experts see this as a strategic response to Washington's trade actions. Given that agricultural states play a pivotal role in U.S. electoral politics, the blow to American farm exports carries consequences not only for the economy, but also for domestic politics. Meanwhile, Russia has moved swiftly to seize the opportunity. In just the first quarter of 2025, Russian beef exports to China surged more than 300% compared to the same period last year. This boom stems from an agreement signed in 2023 that simplified inspection procedures and opened the door for dozens of previously restricted processing facilities. As a result, Russia is emerging as a reliable replacement supplier for the Chinese market, stepping into the space vacated by the United States. A series of major infrastructure investments has allowed Russia to quickly rise as a leading supplier of beef to China. The new railway line, inaugurated at the end of 2024, now links Russia's cattle-producing regions directly to Western China, significantly cutting delivery times. Transactions are also being settled in yuan or rubles, eliminating reliance on the US dollar. According to Russian trade officials, this breakthrough is not only the result of surging Chinese demand, but also stems from bilateral cooperation strategies and improved logistics factors that strengthen Russia's position as a long-term supplier rather than a temporary substitute. China imports nearly 25% of the beef it consumes, a share that the United States once dominated. Today, Russia is gradually filling that void. Moscow has also announced plans to inject an additional $1.1 billion US to double beef production by 2027, with large-scale industrial farming projects already underway. Although concerns about food safety and logistics remain, China appears willing to accept such risks as long as partners align with its political and economic strategies. Meanwhile, longtime suppliers face mounting difficulties. Argentina is reeling from inflation and a volatile trade environment, which constantly shifts costs and prices. Australia, while making progress in restoring trade ties with China, continues to struggle with inconsistent import inspections. These obstacles make it difficult for either country to deliver the stability Beijing now prioritizes to safeguard its food supply security. Russia's rise is not only due to expanded production, but also its ability to capitalize on shifts in Chinese trade policy. Since early 2025, most beef contracts between the two countries have been settled in yuan or rubles, bypassing dollar-based systems altogether. The shortened delivery times enabled by the new rail line, combined with a long-term cooperation framework, have made Russia Beijing's preferred choice for China. Reliability and strategic alignment appear to outweigh absolute precision in quantity or quality standards. In March 2025, China unexpectedly imposed tariffs on more than 700 American agricultural products, including pork, dairy, almonds, and sorghum, covering over $11 billion in bilateral trade. This move came immediately after Washington reinstated tariffs on Chinese technology exports. Observers argue this is not merely a short-term tit for tat, but a sign of an expanding trend toward trade decoupling. Agriculture is increasingly being used as a tool of leverage in international negotiations, rather than treated as a straightforward commodity exchange. What is unfolding may mark a turning point toward lasting change in global trade. The numbers underscore the trend. In 2022, the US supplied more than 12% of China's beef imports. By early 2025, that figure had dropped to less than 6%. With no sign of diplomatic improvement, experts warned that American exporters risk being sidelined from one of the world's fastest-growing protein markets. As Beijing gradually builds new trade networks with countries that share its strategic priorities, the return of former suppliers will only become more difficult. At the same time, Washington is preparing to expand tariffs further on Chinese goods, this time targeting roughly $18 billion US in imports, raising international concerns about escalating tensions. The latest figures show US agricultural exports to China have already fallen by nearly 28% this year alone. Economists caution that such tariff spirals do not provide genuine protection for domestic markets. Instead, they tend to shrink the overall scale of global trade, weakening both sellers and buyers alike. Alongside its tensions with Washington, Beijing is actively signing long-term food supply agreements with Russia and a number of other partners, most of which have completely phased out the use of the US dollar. This is not just a story of tariffs or trade. It represents a profound shift in the structure of global supply chains. China is increasingly turning to countries that share its political outlook, offer stable logistics, and accept flexible payment arrangements. If the United States does not change its approach, the risk goes beyond losing market share. It could mean being left out of Asia's agricultural growth altogether. Against this backdrop, experts argue that Washington needs to shift its focus from short-term retaliatory measures to a clearer long-term strategy. What is happening extends far beyond the notion of a trade dispute. It is in reality a signal of shifting power in international relations. As China redesigns its supply chains, particularly in essential goods such as food, the impact does not stop at any one border. It reshapes regional alliances and unsettles long-standing economic relationships. By tightening its ties with Russia and Kazakhstan, Beijing is building a food security network that intertwines economic interests with diplomatic objectives. And the ripple effects clearly extend well beyond the beef sector. Trade experts are closely monitoring these developments and warning of long-term risks. Deborah Elms of the Asian Trade Center stressed that once logistics infrastructure, payment systems, and inspection standards are firmly tied to new partners, it becomes extremely difficult for former suppliers to return. This is not just a matter of repairing diplomatic relations. It requires rebuilding an entire trade support network from scratch. For this reason, many believe the United States is not merely losing temporary access, but could be excluded from key markets for years to come. On the other hand, China is not placing all of its trust in imports. Domestic beef production rose by more than 5% in 2024, thanks to state investment flowing into key regions such as Inner Mongolia and Sichuan. Clearly, Beijing is pursuing a two-pronged strategy, strengthening international partnerships aligned with its political and financial interests while simultaneously boosting domestic production capacity to reduce dependence. For U.S. exporters, this means facing a dual challenge: fiercer external competition, and China's growing self-sufficiency. On top of that, many of the long-term contracts China has signed with Russia and Kazakhstan are locked in through local currency payment mechanisms and multi-year commitments. These are deliberate strategic measures designed to minimize the dollar's role in trade, and to further shrink America is opportunity to re-enter the market. If current agreements between China and its new partners hold steady, the United States risks not only being sidelined in the short term, but also losing structural ground as Beijing broadens and secures its protein supply from multiple sources. The central question is, can U.S. agriculture adapt? For decades, American exports of beef, soybeans, pork, and dairy relied heavily on Asia's massive buying power. But as new trade ties strengthen and the global financial system evolves, U.S. producers will have to rethink their approach. Either find alternative markets or develop trade strategies that align with the world's new expectations. If it fails to act, the United States risks losing its role in global food trade on a long-term basis. While many farmers and exporters are hoping for a diplomatic breakthrough, the data suggests that a deeper restructuring is already underway. With the tariff spiral showing no sign of easing and multi-year agreements being signed among other countries, simply waiting for the storm to pass may not be enough to salvage America's position. What is needed is a more proactive strategy, expanding markets beyond Asia, improving bilateral trade relations, and engaging more effectively in new global financial mechanisms. What China is doing is no longer purely economic decision-making. Food imports are now tightly linked to diplomacy and geopolitical positioning. By using agricultural trade as a tool, China can reward friendly nations and penalize dissent without resorting to direct confrontation. This is a form of soft power, one that carries risks but is transforming how global trade operates. For those following these developments, the key is not just to look at numbers or tariff rates, but to grasp the broader consequences. Trade disruptions directly affect jobs, food prices, and the vitality of rural communities worldwide. As the global food supply chain becomes increasingly shaped by politics, stability will rely more on cooperation, adaptability, and trust between partners. Without those elements, even the oldest trade relationships can collapse overnight. What is unfolding between the United States and China in agriculture is only one piece of a much larger picture of economic decoupling. From semiconductors to soybeans, the world's two largest economies are redefining how they engage in trade. Policy decisions that once seemed fragmented are now converging into a pattern where supply chains are being reorganized around strategic allies rather than traditional partners. For American agriculture, this means success will no longer rest solely on product quality or pricing, but also on diplomacy and the ability to integrate with shifting global trends. As new shipping routes and agreements are signed, it is clear that agricultural trade is entering a different era. China's pivot to Russia and other politically aligned partners underscores that trade today is more strategic than transactional. Nations are preparing for a future where trade shocks may become frequent, and resilience will be built through diversified partnerships, heavy investment in infrastructure, and reduced dependence on the US dollar. In this new context, adaptability is not optional, it is essential. Looking ahead, we are likely to see rising investment in domestic production across Asia, more long-term contracts gradually sidelining Western exporters, and perhaps an even greater move away from a dollar-based agricultural trade system. These shifts will not happen overnight, but the foundations are already in place. Countries are planning decades ahead, and if U.S. exporters wish to remain competitive, they too will have to adjust their long-term strategies. Although the global landscape is changing rapidly, there is still room to adjust course. Trade has always been a dynamic ecosystem, and history shows that relationships can be reshaped. For the United States, this could mean re-engaging more actively in multilateral trade agreements, reconsidering tariff policies, or expanding alliances into emerging regions such as Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The new reality also requires Washington to consider adopting financial systems better suited to a multipolar world. This will certainly not be an easy step, but it is necessary if the US hopes to maintain its standing in a shifting global economy. The current situation also underscores the rising importance of infrastructure diplomacy. Projects such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, Russia's railway networks, or the yuan ruble payment mechanisms are not simply about commerce. They are instruments of power. For that reason, the US and its allies may need to step up investment, not only in domestic capacity, but also in external structures that can guarantee transparent, stable, and reliable trade. If missed, the US risks not only losing market share to direct competitors, but also falling behind due to structural changes. From a consumer perspective, this shift will inevitably affect both food prices and global supply. As shipping routes are redirected and settlement currencies change, costs will fluctuate and access to products will vary across regions. Food, which once crossed borders freely, may now have to pass through more political gateways. Understanding this landscape is essential not only for policymakers, but also for ordinary citizens and shoppers. Trade is not just about goods and services. It is tied to trust, consensus, and long-term vision. Whether you are a farmer, a political leader, or simply someone who does the weekly grocery run, keeping pace with global trends has become vital. The rise of new partners, the retreat of familiar players, and the redrawing of the global agricultural map all point to one reality. The future of trade will belong to those who are flexible and quick to adapt. It is important to remember that today's trade disruptions do not occur in isolation. They reflect the intersection of many factors, from political leadership changes, energy and financial policies, to the growing impact of global climate change of extreme weather. An unexpected outbreak or bottlenecks along major shipping routes can accelerate trends already triggered by tariffs and diplomatic tensions. In other words, we are living in an era where trade has become more unpredictable than ever. And this uncertainty can be just as disruptive as any policy decision. Behind every statistic on exports or imports are real people. From farm owners and processing plant workers to truck drivers and dockside staff, all tying their livelihoods to a stable trading system. A sudden policy decision or geopolitical move can strip thousands of families of economic security, something not always reflected in financial headlines. This is precisely why a comprehensive understanding of context matters not just for policymakers or investors, but for anyone whose life depends on the smooth functioning of the global supply chain. Yet these challenges also open new doors. Shifting trade relationships may create opportunities for emerging markets, smaller-scale producers, or regional agreements that once seemed unimaginable. Any country or business willing to diversify export destinations, improve transport capacity, or take part in new payment mechanisms will be better positioned to withstand the turbulence and may even secure lasting advantages. Change always comes with risks, but it is also fertile ground for creativity and innovation. Whether you are a farmer in the American Midwest, a trader at a Southeast Asian port, or an investor in Europe, these disruptions directly shape your life. From food prices and job stability to the value of currencies. That is why we aim to offer a clearer, more grounded perspective on these developments, not only to show what is happening, but also to explain why it matters and where it might lead. Beef is only one piece of the larger picture being reshaped. In early March, China's retaliatory tariff package hit roughly $21 billion worth of American agricultural exports, including pork, dairy, sorghum, almonds, and even poultry. Beijing imposed duties of 10 to 15%, citing its response to the Trump administration's trade policies. But according to many experts, this is not merely a countermeasure. It is a long-term strategy designed to exert political pressure directly on America's farm states, critical battlegrounds in US elections. The clearest consequence has been the suspension of hundreds of US beef processing plants' export licenses under the Phase 1 trade agreement. By mid-March, Chinese customs authorities allowed these permits to expire without renewal, causing exports to slow to nearly zero by early April. With no certainty as to when or even if these licenses will be restored, American meat packers face severe unpredictability, limiting not only current shipments, but also their ability to sign new contracts. At the same time, Beijing launched a sweeping review of global beef imports in an effort to rein in domestic oversupply. This review covers import data from 2019 onward and involves major suppliers such as Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Uruguay, and the United States. Results are expected by year's end, potentially leading to tighter import controls with significant consequences for prices. And supply, not just for the US, but for global competitors as well. Beyond beef, China is also accelerating imports of other crops. Beijing has sharply increased purchases of Russian peas and wheat as part of its broader trade cooperation with Moscow. This year, Russia overtook the US in spring wheat exports. And if China lifts its ban on winter wheat, Moscow could further consolidate its position in the market. This shift highlights Beijing's pivot toward bulk staples sourced from politically aligned partners. At the same time, Russia has been leveraging previously seized Western assets such as the canned food company Glav Product to expand exports to China, North Korea, and new markets. While not yet a dramatic leap, these moves reveal Russia's trajectory from an agriculture sector once oriented towards self-sufficiency. It is now evolving into a key export-driven link, increasingly bound to Beijing. This underscores how geopolitics is shaping business strategies and the flow of trade across the region. All of these developments are unfolding against the backdrop of increasingly close economic ties between China and Russia. Their cooperation extends far beyond short-term trade, covering ruble-yuan payment systems, cross-border logistics projects, and long-term strategic agreements. Experts describe this as a deliberate alignment built over many years with the shared goal of countering Western sanctions. It is not a fragile alliance, but rather an institutionalized structure that is steadily expanding. The surge in agricultural trade has also drawn global attention. Even major South American exporters, such as Brazil and Argentina, long dominant in soybeans, beef, and grains, are deepening their ties with China. At the same time, suppliers from Europe, Canada, and the Pacific are targeting the Chinese market to fill the void left by the United States. The result is the emergence of a diversified, multi-currency food supply system that is gradually eroding America's once dominant role. For U.S. exporters, returning to China will involve far more than restarting tariff talks or sitting back down at the negotiating table. They now face a playing field that has been redesigned. Plant registration tied to legal reliability. Payments settled outside the U.S. dollar. Logistics integrated with the Belt and Road Network, and long-term contracts embedded in political relationships. To regain lost market share, the United States will need to recalibrate its strategy on multiple fronts at once. Meanwhile, Beijing continues to expand its scope of pressure. This past March, China imposed tariffs of 10 to 15% on a range of American agricultural goods worth at least $21 billion US, including pork, dairy, almonds, sorghum, and poultry. Analysts argue this is not a simple act of retaliation, but a political strategy designed to directly impact key American farm states, areas with significant influence over U.S. election outcomes. In addition, China allowed hundreds of export licenses for U.S. beef processing plants to expire in mid-March without renewal, effectively halting shipments by early April. With no clear timeline for reapproval, American companies are facing prolonged uncertainty, crippling their ability to secure new contracts and disrupting supply chains. On top of this, Beijing has launched a comprehensive investigation into global beef imports dating back to 2019. China just banned most U.S. beef imports. It's part of a new strategy to reshape global food trade, and it's working. Here's how. First, China has launched a review of beef imports from 91 countries, including major suppliers like Brazil and Argentina, Australia, and the United States. If the results indicate that imports harm domestic production, China could impose further tariffs or even introduce quotas. This means the export window could narrow even further, not just for the US, but for global competitors as well. At the same time, China-Russia agricultural cooperation is also expanding beyond beef. Beijing has sharply increased imports of peas and wheat from Moscow, making Russia the largest supplier of yellow peas today. Analysts believe this shift could soon extend to spring wheat and even winter wheat if China lifts its earlier ban. That would be a clear win for Russia and a worrying sign for the US. In 2024, bilateral trade between China and Russia reached about $245 billion US, with more than 95% of transactions conducted in rubles and yuan, virtually eliminating the role of the US dollar. Want to know more? Check out our full video.